A police officer walks into a restaurant at 1:50 a.m., but she's not there to protect and serve, she's there to rob and kill.
Attorney General Liz Murrill in her office set to be in an Orleans Parish courtroom today.
They continue to respond to post-conviction challenges by former NOPD officer Antoinette Frank. Frank is trying to avoid the death sentence handed down after her conviction in a 1995 triple murder. Prosecutors say Frank was helping her lover, Roger Lacazzi, when she shot and killed 2 restaurant workers and a fellow NOPD officer during a robbery attempt. Frank's attorneys have filed a petition to toss Frank's sentence, arguing that she did not receive adequate defense. But Murrill claims the former NOPD officer has taken too long and exhausted all of her appeal options already. A judge will hear both sides at 9 a.m.
Officer Antoinette Frank pushes past the Vietnamese family cleaning up for the night. Her partner, Officer Ronald Williams, tries to follow. That's when her accomplice strikes. A bullet to the neck drops Williams instantly. Frank stands over her wounded colleague and fires a shot into his head. Execution style. The restaurant owner's children fall to their knees, praying for their lives. Frank shows no mercy. 3 more shots, 2 more bodies. She flees into the night. But then something happens that defies all logic. Frank hears the 911 call on her police radio, so she does the unthinkable. She returns to the scene in full uniform, badge gleaming, pretending to be a responding officer. What she doesn't know is that someone saw everything and they exposed the truth. This is the story of how a badge became a license to kill. This is Criminal Tapes. Please like and subscribe to our channel to be the first to know about future executions that matter. This is Antoinette Frank. She was 23 years old at the time, a New Orleans Police Department officer for less than 2 years. On the surface, she seemed like exactly what the city needed, young, determined, and a top graduate from her police academy class. But on March 4th, 1995, at 1:50 in the morning, Frank would shatter that image forever. The scene was the Kim An restaurant in eastern New Orleans, a quiet Vietnamese family business run by the hard-working Vu family. Frank knew this place well. She worked there during her off-duty hours as a security guard. The family trusted her. They gave her a key. She was supposed to protect them. That night, 3 people would die in that restaurant. Officer Ronald Williams II, Frank's colleague and sometime partner, was working security that evening. He was a married father of 2. His wife had just given birth to their second child 4 days earlier. Avu was 21 years old. She dreamed of becoming a nun. Her 17-year-old brother, Quang, wanted to be a priest. They were devout, peaceful people who had immigrated to America seeking a better life. All 3 were dead before 2 a.m. But this wasn't just a triple murder. This wasn't even just about one corrupt cop gone wrong. What happened at Kim An restaurant was the symptom of a diseased system. The New Orleans Police Department was rotting from the inside out. Officers were robbing banks, dealing drugs, and committing rape. In the past year alone, Frank had become the 4th NOPD officer charged with murder. The badge that was supposed to represent justice had become something else entirely. And Antoinette Frank was about to prove just how far that corruption could go. To understand how Antoinette Frank became a killer, you need to understand the broken system that created her. The New Orleans Police Department in 1995 was a disaster waiting to happen. Police officers in New Orleans were among the lowest paid in any major American city. A fresh recruit made just $14,900 a year. Even a 20-year veteran earned only $30,000. That's poverty wages for people carrying guns and badges. The results were predictable and devastating. Between 10 and 15% of the department's 1,500 officers were estimated to be corrupt. Since 1993, 40 officers had been arrested on charges ranging from bank robbery to rape to drug dealing. Just months before Frank's murders, an FBI sting operation had rocked the city. 10 police officers were caught red-handed. Undercover agents found cops ripping off drug dealers, and 29 officers willing to guard a warehouse containing 130 kilos of cocaine during their off-duty hours. The corruption wasn't just widespread, It was systematic. Antoinette Frank should never have been given a badge and gun. The warning signs were everywhere, but the department ignored them all. Frank failed not one, but 2 psychiatric evaluations before being hired. Dr. Philip Scuria, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated her, was crystal clear in his recommendation. He explicitly warned the department not to hire her. She lacked basic emotional resilience, decisiveness, and confidence under pressure. These weren't minor concerns. These were fundamental flaws that made her unfit for police work. But that wasn't all. Frank had lied on multiple sections of her employment application. Any honest background check should have disqualified her immediately. So why was she hired anyway? Desperation? The NOPD was bleeding officers faster than they could replace them. They needed bodies in uniform, and Frank's application came at the right time. The department was also under pressure to diversify its ranks in a majority black city, and Frank fit that need. Once on the force, Frank's problems became obvious to everyone around her. Fellow officers described her as shy, detached, and socially awkward. But there was something else, something harder to put into words. A coldness, a vacancy behind her eyes. Her colleagues didn't think she understood what police work really meant. She wasn't cut out for it, and everyone knew it. The final piece of the corruption puzzle was New Orleans' detail system. Because police salaries were so low, officers were expected to work off-duty security jobs to survive. They called it detail work. Many officers worked 40 or more extra hours per week in full uniform. They made between $10 and $15 an hour. For many cops, these security jobs became more important than their actual police work. Some officers literally slept in their patrol cars during regular shifts to save energy for their detail work. This system created the perfect breeding ground for corruption. Officers with access to guns, badges, and authority were working private jobs with minimal oversight. November 25, 1994. Officer Antoinette Frank responded to a shooting call. The victim was Rogers Lacaze, an 18-year-old drug dealer bleeding in the street. Most cops would have seen a criminal. Frank saw something else entirely. Lacaze was smooth-talking and dangerous. He had the kind of bad boy charm that some people find irresistible. Frank was one of them. She later claimed she was just trying to help him turn his life around. But the truth was much darker. Frank knew exactly who Lacaze was. She knew he dealt drugs. She knew he'd been shot before, probably by rivals or angry customers. She knew he was trouble, but she didn't care. Within weeks of that first meeting, their relationship had turned romantic. It was a secret affair that Frank tried desperately to hide from her fellow officers. She was risking her career, her reputation, and her freedom. But she was completely under Lacaze's spell. The good girl cop had fallen for the street criminal, and it would cost 3 innocent people their lives. The relationship between Frank and Lacaze quickly spiraled out of control. Other police officers started noticing strange things. Lacaze was driving Frank's personal car around town. Even worse, he was spotted inside her police unit at crime scenes. When questioned, Frank had ready excuses. Sometimes she introduced Lacaze as her trainee. Other times she called him her nephew. She always had an explanation, but none of them made sense. Soon, witnesses began reporting something much more serious. Frank and Lacaze were allegedly pulling over motorists together. Frank would use her uniform and authority to stop cars, then she and Lacaze would rob the drivers. They had turned her police badge into a tool for armed robbery. The couple was becoming bolder and more reckless with each crime. Frank was no longer just dating a criminal, she had become one herself. And Lacaze was leading her deeper into a world of violence and lawlessness that would soon explode into murder. On February 4, 1995, Civil Sheriff Irvin Bryant witnessed something that should have ended Frank's career immediately. He saw a police car with flashing lights and assumed it was a routine traffic stop. But as he got closer, he realized something was very wrong. Frank was in uniform, watching as Lacaze waved a Tech-9 semi-automatic weapon during a violent fight. When Bryant intervened and restrained Lacaze, Frank defended her criminal boyfriend. She told Bryant that Lacaze was the good guy and ordered him released. Despite witnessing a uniformed officer protecting an armed criminal, Bryant was never questioned by police. No investigation was launched, no charges were filed. Less than a month later, 3 people would be dead. The Kimon restaurant was supposed to be Frank's safe haven. She had worked there as an off-duty security guard for months. The Vu family had welcomed her with open arms. They trusted her completely. They even gave her a key to the restaurant so she could come and go as needed. Frank knew everything about the family's routines. She knew when they closed. She knew where they kept their money. She knew they often had large amounts of cash on hand from the day's business. Most importantly, she knew they would never suspect her of wanting to hurt them. The Vu family saw Frank as their protector. They had no idea she was planning to become their killer. March 4th, 1995, started like any other night at Kimon Restaurant. The family was cleaning up after closing time. Officer Ronald Williams was working his security shift, looking forward to going home to his wife and newborn baby. Frank and Lacaze had already visited the restaurant twice that evening. Both times they came to get leftover food. The visits seemed innocent enough, but something felt different to Chow Vu, one of the restaurant owner's daughters. During Frank's second visit, Chow noticed she couldn't find the front door key when it was time to let Frank out. Frank claimed she didn't know where it was, but Chow had a sinking feeling that Frank had taken it. When Frank returned for a third time, this time alone, Chow's worst fears were confirmed. Something was terribly wrong. Frank's energy was different, her behavior was strange. Chow's instincts screamed danger. Acting quickly, Chow ran to the kitchen and hid the restaurant's cash inside the microwave. It was a desperate move that would save the money but couldn't save the lives that were about to be lost. Frank entered through the front door using the key she had stolen earlier. She moved with purpose, pushing Chow, her brother Kwok, and another employee toward the kitchen doorway. Officer Williams, sensing trouble, started to follow them to see what was happening. That's when Lacaze struck. He had been hiding, waiting for the perfect moment. As Williams approached the kitchen, Lacaze slipped behind him like a shadow. The first shot hit Williams in the neck, severing his spinal cord and dropping him instantly. Williams was paralyzed, helpless, unable to defend himself or anyone else. What happened next was pure evil. As Williams lay paralyzed on the floor, Lacaze continued shooting. Bullet after bullet tore into the wounded officer's head and back. There was no mercy, no hesitation. It was an execution. In the chaos, Chow and Kwok managed to drag the other employee into the walk-in cooler at the back of the kitchen. They turned off the light and hid in the darkness, listening in terror to the sounds of murder. Frank and Lacaze found Ha and Kwang Vu in the dining room. The siblings were forced to their knees. In their final moments, they did what their faith had taught them. They prayed. Frank showed no compassion. She pistol-whipped 17-year-old Kwang when he couldn't tell her where the money was hidden. Then she found the cash in the microwave herself. Ha Vu, 21 years old and dreaming of becoming a nun, was shot 3 times as she knelt in prayer. Her brother, Kwang, was shot 6 times. Both died instantly, their prayers cut short by Frank's bullets. After the murders, Frank and Lacaze fled the scene in a battered Toyota. 3 people lay dead inside Kimon Restaurant. The killers had stolen the night's cash and disappeared into the darkness of New Orleans. But Chow and Kwok Vo were still alive, trapped in the walk-in cooler. They tried desperately to call 911 on Chow's cell phone, but the thick walls of the cooler blocked the signal. Finally, Kwok managed to slip out and run to a neighbor's house. The emergency call was made. What happened next defied all logic and reason. Frank heard the 911 dispatch over her portable police radio. Officer down at Kimon Restaurant. Instead of running or hiding, she made a calculated decision that showed just how twisted her mind had become. She borrowed a police patrol car and drove back to the scene of her own crime. Frank arrived in full uniform, badge gleaming under the restaurant's lights. She stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward the building, pretending to be just another officer responding to the emergency call. Her plan was simple and terrifying. She wanted to kill the remaining witness. But as Frank entered through the back door, Chow Vu was at the front of the restaurant, waiting for help to arrive. When Frank emerged from the back, Chow saw her immediately. The confrontation was swift and damning. Chow looked directly at Frank and screamed the words that would seal the corrupt officer's fate. "You saw what happened. You killed my brother and sister." Frank tried to play innocent. She claimed she had no idea what was going on. She even pretended to investigate the scene, acting like she was just another cop trying to solve the crime. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. The survivors knew exactly who she was and what she had done. Frank's arrest was swift, but the investigation revealed just how sloppy the killers had been. Under questioning, Frank gave conflicting stories about her whereabouts that night. Her alibis kept changing, and none of them held up under scrutiny. Lacaze made an even bigger mistake. Minutes after the murders, he used Officer Williams' credit card at a nearby gas station. The transaction was captured on security cameras, providing investigators with a clear timeline and undeniable evidence linking him to the crime. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both Frank and Lacaze eventually confessed to their roles in the massacre. Frank's service weapon was linked to the murders through ballistics testing. She had recently reported the gun stolen, but investigators quickly determined this was a lie designed to cover her tracks. The confessions revealed the cold, calculated nature of the crimes. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was premeditated murder, carried out by people who had sworn to protect and serve. The murders sent shockwaves through New Orleans. For the first time in the city's memory, a police officer had been accused of killing a fellow officer. Mayor Mar Montreal ordered all flags flown at half-staff and called it the most difficult week of his administration. The Kiman murders weren't Frank's first killings. 2 years earlier, in 1993, she had filed a missing person report that would later reveal another dark secret. Frank told police that her father, Adam Frank, had vanished without a trace. She claimed he had been staying at her home for a short period before disappearing completely. According to her story, he simply walked out one day and never came back. The case never made headlines. There were no searches, no follow-up investigations, no media coverage. In a city plagued by violence and missing persons, Adam Frank's disappearance was just another file that gathered dust. Police had no reason to suspect his own daughter of foul play. The truth about Adam Frank's fate emerged in the most disturbing way possible. In November 1995, just 1 month after Frank was sentenced to death for the restaurant murders, a neighbor's dog began acting strangely. The animal kept scratching obsessively at the ground beneath Frank's house. The neighbor grew concerned and called police to investigate. What they found was horrifying. Buried in the dirt under Frank's foundation was a human skull with a bullet hole in the back. The remains had been there for years, hidden just feet below where Frank had been living. Police believed the skull belonged to Adam Frank. DNA testing was never publicly completed, but investigators were convinced that Frank had murdered her own father and buried him beneath her home. The motive became clear during psychological evaluations. Frank revealed that her father had repeatedly sexually abused her throughout her childhood. He was controlling, violent, and had destroyed her innocence years before she ever put on a police uniform. Frank had apparently reached her breaking point, killed her abuser, and buried the evidence literally under her own feet. But prosecutors never charged her with this murder. As one officer put it, "What's the point? She's already on death row." Rogers Lacaze's trial moved with lightning speed. In July 1995, just 4 months after the murders, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. His fate was sealed by his own stupidity. The credit card evidence was overwhelming. Security cameras had captured Lacaze using Officer Williams' credit card at a gas station just minutes after the murders. There was no way to explain it away, no possible defense. Lacaze's lawyers had nothing to work with. The evidence was clear, the timeline was perfect, and their client had already confessed. The jury took one look at the facts and delivered the only verdict that made sense. LaCaze would join Frank on death row. Frank's trial was even more dramatic, but for all the wrong reasons. Her legal team seemed to give up before the trial even began. They subpoenaed 39 witnesses who could have testified on her behalf, but when the trial started, they called exactly 0 of them. It was as if her defense attorneys had thrown in the towel. They offered no real defense, no explanation for her actions, no attempt to save her life. The trial lasted just 1 week. The evidence against Frank was overwhelming. Survivors took the stand and identified her as the killer. Ballistics experts linked her service weapon to the murders. Her own confession was read to the jury. The jury didn't even need a lunch break, 22 minutes. That's all it took for them to return a guilty verdict on all counts. It was a New Orleans record for a capital murder case. The next day they deliberated her sentence. 45 minutes later they recommended death. Even the judge looked stunned by the speed of their decision. On October 20th, 1995, Antoinette Frank was officially sentenced to die by lethal injection. She was transferred to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she became the only woman on the state's death row. Detective Eddie Rance, who had led the investigation, summed up what everyone was thinking. "She's the coldest person I've ever met," he said, "and I've been doing this for 30 years. Frank showed no emotion as her sentence was read. No tears, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives she had destroyed. She simply stared ahead with the same vacant expression that had troubled her fellow officers from the beginning. Frank's attorneys launched appeal after appeal, arguing she had been denied proper legal representation and funding for expert witnesses. They claimed Frank was suffering from PTSD and severe childhood trauma that had warped her mind. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate her mental state. Some testified that Frank had endured years of abuse and neglect, that her mind was fractured, and she wasn't inherently evil, just tragically broken. Despite these arguments, her execution was delayed multiple times. Death warrants were signed and then revoked. Legal challenges kept her alive year after year. In 2023, Louisiana Governor John Edwards announced his opposition to the death penalty and pushed for its abolition. Sensing an opportunity, 56 of the 57 inmates on Louisiana's death row, including Frank, petitioned for clemency. But the state parole board wasn't interested in mercy. They rejected every single petition. Frank's clemency plea was officially denied in October 2023. Then everything changed again. In 2025, Louisiana introduced nitrogen hypoxia as a new execution method and carried out their first execution in 15 years. But Frank wasn't on the list. She still had legal appeals pending, keeping her alive while other death row inmates faced their final moments. Frank's case exposed massive failures in police hiring and oversight. The department's desperation for officers led them to ignore psychiatric warnings and background check lies. After the murders, New Orleans implemented major reforms, better pay, stricter hiring standards, and FBI oversight to rebuild community trust. Should childhood trauma excuse a killer's actions? Can someone who murders in cold blood ever deserve mercy? Frank remains on death row today, nearly 30 years after her crimes. What do you think? Justice or mercy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking true crime cases.